Welcome, everyone. My name is Christine Biglin. I'm with St. Mary's County Library, and tonight we have Dr. Matthew Raidbard. Before we get started, I do just want to thank all of you for the work that you do as coaches. Personally, I have 5 kids and they've played tons of sports in St. Mary's County, and I thank you on behalf of parents everywhere for the time that you volunteer. And I can thank a few of you personally because I recognize a couple of names that have coached my kids. So thank you very much. And I hope that we have something that will add a little value to the job that you do. So let me introduce Dr. Matthew Raidbard. He has been a player and he has been a coach at the college level, and he's now moved into sports administration. And he also has a PhD. So welcome, Matthew Raidbard.
Thanks, Christine. Thank you so much to the library for having me and for our collaboration on this program. It's been really great and I'm extremely excited about it. I'm glad that we've got a lot of attendees who are interested in the topic as well. Like Christine said, I hope we bring some value here and that you learn and get something out of the program. Definitely as we go, feel free to put things in the chat. We'll also go through some different exercises where I'll ask you to put your answers into the chat. We'll take a brief pause and then kind of talk through some of the different activities and scenarios as well. So we definitely want everybody to be engaged and involved in the program. And again, we hope it brings a lot of value. Like Christine said, I've been a men's basketball coach, college athletics administrator for the past 15 years. And I recently published a book called Lead Like a Pro, Effective Leadership Styles for Athletic Coaches. And really a lot of my work and what I have done in my career and continue to do is, really try to emphasize the role that leadership plays for coaches at all levels of sports. And that's, not just for, me at the college level, coach at the high school level, youth sports coaches, if you're coaching your son or daughter's team, you're coaching rec leagues, you're a leader and, you should have available to you leadership training and leadership resources to help you be able to take on that outsized leadership role that coaches at all levels of sports are being asked to take on now for their kids and their team. So a lot of what we're going to do tonight is really working through a lot of different leadership styles and behaviors, trying to help you determine what are the best leadership styles for you to practice that align with your personal leadership values and beliefs. So that's what a lot of the exercises are going to be centered on. And again, if you have questions or things come up during, please feel free to put them in the chat as we kind of go through things here. So the first thing we're going to start off with is kind of working to match your leadership style with a lot of your coaching goals so that the leadership decisions you're making are intentional and they're hopefully getting you towards accomplishing those goals that you've set out for your athletes and your team. So, we'll kind of go through a little game plan here. First, we're going to be working on identifying what those leadership goals are that you have. We're going to be talking about some different leadership styles and their key behaviors that could help you on your path to accomplishing those goals. We're going to work on determining what are your core leadership values that are really at the root of who you are as a leader. And then we're going to be working to match those leadership values with your leadership style to kind of bring it all together here and really help you build your leadership practice. So coaching goals, these are, what do you want for your team? What do you want for your kids? And, these are going to be different for everybody. They might change for you year to year, but, these are just some examples of coaching goals. You want everybody to have fun. You want to create a really positive culture, build a team first mentality. These are your goals for the team. These are what's important to you as a leader. And again, they're going to be different for everybody. Some people have similar ones. Year to year, they might change a little bit depending on the team that you're coaching, the experience level, the expectations. But every coach should have team goals that they go into each season saying, I want to make sure everybody has fun. I want to make sure we build a positive culture. And what we're going to help you do in this workshop is really build up your leadership practice to help you get to those goals or help you get to those goals as best as you can over the course of a season through all of your leadership decisions. So, the first thing that I always talk about and is really central to my work and the book is, all coaches are leaders and they need to see themselves as leaders. And, one thing I hear from a lot of coaches, and I heard this a lot from coaches at the college level, was this idea that, if you're a professional coach or you're a college coach, if coaching is your full-time job, then you're a leader. But if it's not your full-time job, if you're, a youth sports coach, a rec coach, if you're a parent who's volunteering to coach your child's team, that you're a leader, but that it's different. And, what I tell all coaches is it's not different. All coaches are leaders, whether it's your full-time job or whether you're doing it for a few hours a week for your son or daughter's team. You're still a leader, and all the decisions that you make for your team, for your kids, are leadership decisions. And so I want everybody to always view themselves as a leader and through that light. So, kind of two things that are really going to be central through lines to the entire workshop, is this idea here that a coach can't be an effective leader without first understanding who they are as a leader. And that's the foundation of your leadership practice, and that comes from within. Those are your core values and beliefs on which we're going to build your leadership practice. So, for me, for example, when I got into coaching, looking at what was important to me, I'm a very positive person. I believe in being really upbeat and motivational and inspirational for my athletes. And I also really want to try to build really positive, strong relationships with my athletes based on mutual trust and respect. So those are values that are important to me that throughout my entire career have always been at the foundation of my leadership practice. And for everybody, it's going to be a little different. And we'll talk through a bunch of different values later that you'll be able to kind of pick out which ones kind of align with who you are as a leader. But basically, those values are going to then determine what are your leadership decisions and behaviors that are going to bring those values to the forefront. And then the other, big major point to kind of through line through today's workshop is that leadership practice is not something that just happens. You can't just step into a role as a coach and you're all of a sudden, just because you are a leader doesn't mean that you now have a defined leadership practice. Even if you're a leader in your professional career, in your job, most people who are leaders in their role, and me in administration, I'm leading adults, I'm leading professionals. And my leadership practice for me as an administrator is very different, or different in a lot of ways, from when I was a coach and I was working with 18 to 22-year-olds, or if you're working with, 9 to 12-year-olds or 3 to 5-year-olds, your leadership practice is going to be different because the needs of your population are going to be different. So, over time, working to acquire leadership knowledge, leadership tools, continuing to adjust your leadership practice to best meet the needs of your kids at that time, that's ultimately going to keep your leadership practice evolving. And that's what I want everybody to know, is that leadership practice is always evolving. It's going to be different year to year. It's going to be changing as the needs of your kid change, and that's okay. There's never going to be an endpoint to your development as a leader. So 4 key leadership styles that we're going to talk about that are really great for coaches to practice. As we kind of go through these, I definitely want everybody to be thinking about and even make notes if you want about the different leadership styles and how they're starting to speak to you, which ones you see yourself in, which ones maybe you don't really identify with as much, just so we can try to start to draw some lines here between your leadership practice and some of these leadership styles. So we're going to talk about democratic leadership, autocratic leadership, which is very opposite to democratic leadership, servant leadership, and transformational leadership. And these really are 4 great leadership styles for coaches to practice. So starting off with democratic leadership, which is a leadership style that definitely in the last 10, 15 years has become far more popular for coaches to practice. And a big part of that is because it's in a leadership style that's been identified with kids, with athletes, as being ones they want their coaches to practice. It's an approach to coaching that's based on, soliciting, listening to, valuing opinions from all team members before making team decisions. It really is more of a democracy. depending on how you set it up, it's not necessarily going to be a voting democracy, but it's definitely a representative democracy in terms of everybody has the opportunity to give their opinions, thoughts, and ideas when you're making those team decisions. So, this is kind of what it looks like. And this is kind of the why behind coaches practice it. You're building a culture of trust and respect. You're telling your athletes, I trust and respect that you're going to give me your true opinions, that you put forth, what you really believe is important for this team, what you believe is the best decision for the team. And there's a lot of trust there. And that really helps cultivate buy-in, and I've seen this at the youngest levels of sports, kids, developing that sense of buy-in because they've been given that opportunity to give their opinion to their coach. And it doesn't always have to start off as a big decision. You could kind of start off your democratic practice in smaller decisions. At the start of the year, I always used to, because I was more of a democratic leader, I always used to ask my guys, what kind of shoes do you think we should get? Do you like this design for our t-shirt? Where do you think we should eat our meal? I would always start off with little things just to get them comfortable giving their opinions. And the amount of buy-in that I would get just from those smaller decisions, allowing them to have input on, was huge. But having that been said, it is a more slow, deliberative approach to decision making, which sometimes can make it difficult because coaches are, sometimes find themselves in positions where they have to make quick decisions in higher pressure situations or with not a lot of time. So it's difficult then to solicit the opinions of everybody. So as a democratic leader, understand that, it's not necessarily always going to look democratic. You've still got to be a little bit flexible. You might not have the time to get those opinions and get that buy-in from everyone on the team. And ultimately, though, when it comes down to whether you're a democratic leader or not, what's important to you as a leader? Is it important to try to solicit buy-in through getting everybody's opinions? Are you a very communal decision maker? That could really help build that strong team first mentality because everybody on the team is playing a role in these decisions that, big or small, are either going to, largely impact or cumulatively impact what a lot of the for the teams are or the achievement of team goals. But, as I said, decision making can become bogged down. Sometimes when you got to make quick decisions, it can be difficult to be more democratic. But ultimately, even though I was more democratic, when there were times when I had to make quick decisions, I still consider myself a democratic leader. It's just at times I had to be a little more autocratic, the next leadership style we'll talk about, because ultimately your leadership practice, it's going to be flexible, it's going to be fluid. That doesn't fundamentally change who you are as a leader. It just means at different times, leaders have to make different decisions and act in kind of different ways. And sometimes they don't wholly reflect who they are, but that's okay. That doesn't change who you are as a leader. It's just, reflective of the situation you found yourself in as a coach. So kind of we're going to go through one of these for each different leadership style. So, these are 4 different scenarios. So kind of based on what I talked about with democratic leadership, I definitely welcome everybody to put in the chat based on these 4 scenarios, which one you see as being democratic or being representative of democratic leadership. So I'll give everybody a minute here to kind of read through them, put it in the chat, and then we'll kind of talk through the scenario. All right, I think we've got a lot of people put their answers in the chat. And what I really like about what people put in the chat is we were really thinking through the different scenarios. So, kind of looking at each kind of one, there's definitely 2 that represent elements of democratic leadership, which some of you put in the chat, and that's awesome. The one that I intended to be the most representative of democratic leadership was number 3. Because it's a form of voting. It's giving every single person, every single team member input. But number 2 is also representative of democratic leadership. It's just mixed with another leadership style, which is really common. And I wanted to put that in there because oftentimes, through your leadership practice, you're going to see aspects of different leadership styles mixed together. It's not always going to be a decision that's representative of one specific leadership style. So, number two, I think is also representative of a democratic leadership style, but it's mixed with a transformational leadership style as well, because it's really based on building strong relationships, which is a hallmark of of transformational leadership. So, definitely you're going to see as we kind of go through this, there's going to be some characteristics of different leadership styles in different scenarios, because there's a lot of crossover between these leadership styles. And especially in your leadership practice, different leadership styles are going to kind of inform each other. But when you're looking kind of purely at a democratic leadership style, you're talking about giving everybody on the team the opportunity to kind of give their opinions and give their ideas. So the next leadership style that we'll talk about is, the opposite of democratic leadership. Autocratic leadership, it's about limiting that input from all your team members. The coach is responsible for making the team decisions, and those decisions are usually made unilaterally or with very little feedback from team members. And even though, a lot of feedback I get from coaches is that autocratic, the connotation of autocratic is not one that they want to be associated with, I would just encourage you to take a little bit of a step back from the name and just think of it in the context of, you're a coach, you were brought in to make team decisions, and you're responsible for their outcomes. So, in that light, I think it makes sense that a lot of coaches would tend to maybe be a little more autocratic, particularly at the start, or if they have a younger or newer team, because you're the coach, and again, you have to make these decisions. You're responsible for their outcomes. So you were brought in to be the coach generally because of your knowledge and experience, your abilities. So it makes sense that as a coach, you would trust that in making decisions over your other team members. So it's a very highly structured leadership style. There's a very clear hierarchy. You are the coach, and then there's kind of a hierarchy from there for team members with your athletes more towards the bottom, very limited input from them. Maybe you give a little bit of input from assistant coaches who are higher on the kind of hierarchy, but ultimately it's a top-down approach that's very heavily weighted towards you at the top. And, one thing with autocratic leadership is, you may be thinking to yourself, well, if I'm an autocratic leader, how do I get buy-in if I'm not allowing team members to really contribute to decision-making? And, one way that autocratic leaders really can solicit a lot of buy-in is by making very confident decisions that move their team towards accomplishing goals and accomplish goals. Because ultimately, if you're making really good decisions that the team sees as making progress or sees as leading towards the accomplishment of goals, they're going to buy in and trust that you're making great decisions on their behalf. And it's not going to be, for most team members, as important that they contribute to that decision making, because you've built that trust and equity in yourself as the unquestioned leader. It's definitely one where you have a lot more control over the decision making. Therefore, if something doesn't work, it's easier for you to then reflect back on how you made that decision, how you got through that process when you're kind of evaluating your decisions. But it's definitely difficult at the beginning because you can't get that buy-in overnight just from making a few decisions right away. It definitely comes over time. It comes from consistency. It comes from reinforcing that structure. And it comes from that trust that comes from the team seeing that you're leading them in the right direction. You're leading them towards the accomplishment of team goals. But it's definitely one that you want to be kind of leery of because, again, if your team members aren't totally buying into the decisions that you're making, even if they're the right decisions, it's going to inhibit your ability to accomplish goals because they might not be giving their all if they're not buying into the decisions that you're making. So in this exercise, I'll give everybody a minute again, kind of read through, which scenario you think is autocratic, and also feel free to put in the chat if there's another scenario you feel like there are elements of autocratic leadership in as well. So I think we've got a lot of answers, and definitely the consensus was number one. You know, coach brings everybody over to the sidelines and says, this is the play that we're running. Coach made the decision. Coach didn't ask for buy-in. Coach didn't ask for any assistance, like in number 4, you know, or in number 3. I think there's, you know, a little bit of an element to number 2, because coach has limited the options and said, here's a few opportunities, or here's a few plays that we can run. But definitely number 1 is the most truly representative of autocratic leadership, where coach has made a decision and that decision is final. And now coach expects the athletes to go out and perform that play. So the next leadership style in our 4 here is servant leadership. You know, servant leadership is a leadership style that I think everybody who makes the decision to be a coach is, at least in some small aspect, practicing servant leadership. Because inherently, servant leadership is based on putting the needs of the athletes and the team above everything else, above your needs, above everything else. And ultimately, when you make the decision to be a coach, you're making a decision to basically make it your job to work to, you know, help the learning, growth, and development of your athletes. And to me, that's inherently a servant leadership behavior, servant leadership characteristic, because you've made a decision to put the needs of your athletes first. There's a lot of other things you could be doing, careers you could be doing, jobs you could be doing, that put you in the forefront, or your needs first, or first and foremost. But ultimately, you've made the decision to put the needs of your kids first, and that's the most fundamental servant leadership trait. It's also about modeling really great behaviors for your kids, behaviors that you want them to emulate in the way that you're practicing them. Unselfishness, listening, empathy, teamwork, inclusion, you know, really great behaviors. You're demonstrating these and you're saying that they're important. They're important to the team culture. They're important to you as a leader. But how you're acting them out is also representative of how you want your athletes to try to, you know, emulate or model what you're doing. So, you know, if you expect your team to, you know, focus and have good eye contact and listen to you, you know, that's what you're going to kind of model and portray to them as a servant leader. You know, it's also about displaying that empathy, that caring for what others are going through, you know, knowing that. And I think what's so key for coaches is, you know, ultimately it's about kids. It's about what they're going through, what they're experiencing on a human level. We're doing that through sports. But as a servant leader, you're really tapping into that and displaying a lot of caring and empathy for what's going on, trying to build that connection. So our pros and cons, you know, this is a leadership style that really helps you develop the leadership abilities of your athletes, because you're modeling those behaviors and you're really trying to build up their leadership abilities through those behaviors that you're modeling. You're demonstrating a really great way to be a leader to them. You're encouraging them to develop their leadership abilities. You know, you're putting forward a very team first mentality. You're doing it in a very humble way by putting the needs of everybody above your own. And you're giving your trust to others that ultimately they are going to take that team first mentality. They are going to take kind of what you're giving them as a leader, what you're modeling, and they're going to go and they're going to act on that. They're going to display those behaviors in the way that are consistent with what you would like to see your kids do. You know, a couple of drawbacks, you know, not all kids are comfortable with the servant leader approach. You know, depending on, you know, their background, their personality, you know, they might not be very, you know, some people don't love praise. Some people don't like to feel like they're kind of, you know, being put forth first. You know, they feel more comfortable blending in. They feel more comfortable being just one of the team. And servant leadership can shine a little bit of a light on individuals at times. So that's just something to be kind of careful of as a coach, that if you notice you have athletes who aren't as comfortable kind of being put first by you, that you kind of do your best to create more of a we scenario where you're kind of in it with them. You know, you're putting them first, but you're in it together so that they're more comfortable while you kind of work to build that relationship, and they really trust that, you know, what you're doing, what you're putting forth is in their best interests. And, you know, ultimately with servant leadership, really try to just focus on the needs of those individual athletes and just really try to understand what's their comfort level, because servant leadership puts a lot forward for your athletes very quickly before you've had a chance to really build that relationship that's based on trust, like in these other leadership styles. It's a lot harder to ease into servant leadership. So just try to really be conscious of that. So, we'll go through servant leadership now with our different scenarios. Give everybody a minute and kind of put in the chat which scenario you see as being representative of servant leadership. Think we've got a lot of answers, and everybody nailed it on this one. Number 4, definitely representative of servant leadership. It's about putting the needs of your athletes first, considering what's best for them, and that can be difficult as a coach. I know for me early in my career, and it took me a while to kind of figure this out. I definitely was somebody who had an idea of how I wanted the team structure to look, how I wanted the culture to look, what I wanted to emphasize. And early in my career, I didn't understand the importance of considering the needs of my athletes, putting those needs first. And oftentimes I was trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, because I was focusing on what I wanted to do versus what was the best for my athletes. And in that scenario, if you kind of come across that you feel that way, that's okay. You're not doing anything wrong. I would say that, try to find a balance. For me, it was trying to figure out what are the needs of my athletes while still trying to remain true to what's important to me. If I felt like an athlete wasn't really that interested in building a relationship, was kind of, more reserved, I just took a really slow and steady approach. Didn't give too much too fast, even though I wanted to try to build that relationship with them. So you really just try to find that balance with servant leadership, and always keep the needs of your kids in mind when you're kind of making decisions, taking forward with some of those actions, so that, again, they're comfortable with kind of the approach you're taking, but also so that you're remaining true to yourself and the leader that you want to be. So the last leadership style we'll talk about is transformational leadership. Transformational leadership is the leadership style that most coaches, or the largest number of coaches, practice or want to practice or see themselves practicing, which makes sense because it's based on inspiration and motivation. The job of your coach is to inspire and motivate your athletes to believe that they could accomplish more than they thought they could on their own, to believe that they're capable of more than they ever thought. And fundamentally, I think that's what a lot of coaches believe, or what a lot of coaches base a lot of their leadership practice on as a coach. They're here to motivate and inspire. I think that's a lot of at the foundation of a lot of people's leadership practice. If it's not for yours, that's totally fine. But it's just a leadership style that a lot of people kind of identify with different aspects of. It's also a leadership style that, even above democratic leadership, athletes have been shown to respond best to. And that makes sense. It's human nature. A lot of positive, clear, direct communication, a lot of, again, playing up of athlete strengths while minimizing their weaknesses. Whether it's sports leadership or organizational leadership, people respond really well to that. And it's definitely also based on building really strong relationships with your athletes. And again, that's something that's a through line in a lot of different leadership styles, but it's really the most fundamental to transformational leadership, because it's a relationship that transcends the typical player-coach relationship. And really, it's more of a bond. That's a reason why transformational leadership spoke so much to me, because a big reason why I wanted to be a college basketball coach is because I wanted to have a positive impact on my athletes' lives during a very important time, and build those bonds to where after they left college, after they left the team, we still remain connected. And that's still some of the best memories that I have of coaching, and some of the best relationships I have to this day. And that was so important to me as a coach. There are different levels of that. But as a coach, if relationships are really important to you, if really getting to know your athletes on a human level is really important to you, that's a very strong transformational leadership characteristic. It's also about your communication style. Another pro of transformational leadership is, you're communicating in a very direct, positive way. Again, you're using language that's motivational and inspirational. You're modeling behaviors like hard work. You're trying to instill a sense of purpose. People respond really well to that. You're filling them with confidence and belief that hopefully is going to inspire and motivate them. But there, just like every leadership style, there can be cons, there can be unintended consequences or drawbacks. And transformational leadership can be a difficult leadership style to be flexible with in order to meet the needs of each of your individual kids. That was something I struggled with early in my career was, I really had trouble gauging how much motivation, how much inspiration each of my kids needed without compromising my leadership style. I didn't want to just turn into a cheerleader. I wanted to provide motivation and inspiration, but some kids didn't really need a lot of it. Others needed a lot more and a lot more attention. So just trying to find that balance as a transformational leader is just something that you need to be kind of cognizant of and just kind of navigate your way through. So in our last activity for this part, we'll talk through, I'll give everybody a minute to kind of read through the different transformational leadership scenarios, and then we'll talk through them. I think we've got most people's answers. Definitely number 2 is the most representative of transformational leadership. Using that positive, motivational, inspirational language is fundamental to transformational leadership. But I also want to draw everybody's attention to number 4, which is, I intended to be a kind of combination of servant leadership and also transformational leadership, because a really powerful transformational leadership tool that I hope everybody can take away who practices transformational leadership is that it isn't always motivational and inspirational through your communication. It can also be a very powerful tool for practicing transformational leadership, can be through your behaviors. So by you demonstrating hard work and dedication, which are fundamental to servant leadership, but by you displaying that, it's also a form of transformational leadership, because I know for me, when I see other people working really hard, that I care about, that I respect, I become more motivated to work hard. When I see people being very dedicated to the team or the organization, that helps to motivate and inspire me as well. So definitely number 2 is the most representative, but also number 4, I want to just highlight just the power that your actions can have in being motivational and inspirational as well as a transformational leader. So in the next part, we'll go through another activity, and this is about prioritizing your leadership values. So, we've got a number of values here on the left side of your screen. They correspond to all of our different leadership styles. Some correspond to more than one leadership style. And that's as we kind of go forward, you'll see that aspects of your leadership practice are going to show up in different leadership styles. That's great. That's what's forming your unique leadership practice. These kind of values and behaviors they're fundamental and at your core, what's important to you as a leader. So, if you have the sheet, if you don't, you could just rank them on a piece of paper. But ultimately, we just kind of want you to create your list of, what are the most 2 least important values for you as a leader. And, if you think one's not important at all, leave it off. Or if you think all of them are important to varying degrees, you can, feel free to create your full list with all the different behaviors. Kind of once you've gone through and ranked everything, the next step we'll take is And I'll give everybody a minute here to kind of go through and rank, and then we'll go to the kind of next step.
This was the first paper of the handouts that I sent to everybody. So if you did cut them apart, you can move them around in front of you. Like I kind of like that style of, physical things to move around. But, you can certainly just put numbers on the piece of paper with it or jot them down on a spare piece of paper.
As some people are finishing up, and as a few more of you keep finishing up, I'll just start kind of talking through the next step, which is just kind of circle or indicate, however you're doing it, which of those values are the most essential for you to practice. And this is not necessarily going to be the ones that you have the highest ranked. It might be 1, 2, 3, 4 you think are the most essential, or it might be kind of ones that you think are a little further down the list that you think are essential, but that you don't, value as much in a leader. And maybe that's an indicator of something that you want to change about your leadership practice or rethink. But I just want to kind of go, have everybody go through and just think about what are the most essential. And that also may, that may change your list a little bit. It doesn't necessarily have to, but I don't necessarily think that the most important and the most essential are always going to be the same for everybody in terms of leadership. And I'll say for B, when I went through this activity earlier, which was really interesting for me as well, authority was a leadership behavior that was further down on my list of most important. But when I went through and really started thinking about essential values for me, I circled authority. Even though it was near the bottom of my list, because I didn't consider myself to be very authoritative or really, I never really considered myself to be a very strong authority figure as a coach. But when I started thinking about, well, no matter how I necessarily viewed it, my authority was essential to my role. Me being viewed as the coach, as the leader, me gaining that trust, authority was essential to that. So it really made me rethink where I was going to put authority, or even the role that authority plays in whatever form in my leadership practice. So you may come across some of those types of situations as well for your leadership values. And then as everybody's finishing up with that, we will move forward to the next page and take your most essential values, take your most important values, and put them into the kind of leadership circles that they correspond to. And that's going to really form the foundation and represent kind of your leadership practice. Where you kind of view where you're at as a leader, what's important to you, what's essential, that kind of maybe that mixture of both, depending on how you kind of view things. If you focused on resiliency and development and fairness, now we're kind of seeing that you're more of a transformational democratic leader. If you focused more on that, transparency, honesty, authority, and resiliency, you're more of an autocratic transformation leader. You may have some from all of them, and that's perfectly fine. That's your unique leadership practice, and that's okay. That's great. You may really have focused on, for me, I focus a lot on transformational leadership, and I came up with a little bit of servant and democratic leadership. That kind of formed my practice when I went through this activity. So we're just building out what is kind of the basis or the foundation of your unique leadership practice. And then kind of as you kind of finish up and kind of see what the foundation of your leadership practice is, if you're comfortable, I think it would be really interesting if you could put kind of in the chat, what is the leadership practice that you came up with? Mine was very strong transformational leadership with aspects of servant leadership and democratic leadership. That was what I came up with when I kind of went through this activity. So if you're comfortable, if you wouldn't mind putting it in the chat so we can kind of see where everybody falls. There's never a right or wrong answer in leadership. It's all about figuring out what's right for you. So and that's really the importance of this activity. Transformational. More transformational and elements of servant and autocratic. That's fantastic. Democratic, autocratic, transformational, servant, democratic. This is so fantastic. I think, what I really love about this activity is we could all see how we're all different types of leaders, and there's so many different ways to be a leader. There's so many different ways to kind of approach leadership, and I think that's what's so great about it. And I think what's so interesting is if you did this activity again in a year, I bet you for a number of us, our leadership may come out different. Our rankings would probably come out different for a lot of us. Our leadership styles maybe in a year wouldn't necessarily change that much. Maybe it would, depending on the person and the situation, but it's definitely something to keep thinking about as your leadership style continues to kind of change and evolve. So, in the kind of last part here, before we kind of move forward and wrap up and get to some questions, now we want to take all of what we learned about our leadership practice, and we want to help all of that information, help all of that insight, get us towards our coaching goals. So, based on your coaching goals or what you think are important for your coaching goals, we want everybody to rank these coaching goals. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be all of them. It could be a few of them or however many are important to you. But ultimately, these are the goals that all of the decisions that you make as a leader, they're going to help you hopefully get towards these goals. So, kind of for me, when I was thinking through this, one thing that was always so important for me when I was a college basketball coach, it was always the top fun. I viewed it a little differently. I always wanted my athletes to have a really great experience. Certainly fun was a major element of that. But in thinking about my leadership practice and the decisions that I was making, I always wanted to make sure that those decisions I was making were helping me get towards that goal of everybody having a great experience. So, for me, one really important aspect of that was building strong relationships with my athletes, really getting to know them on a personal level so that we really built that strong connection that transcended typical player-coach relationships. There's a lot of different tools I use to do that. But ultimately, all the leadership decisions I was making were hopefully getting me towards, all of my kids having a great experience. So that's what your leadership decisions based on leadership styles that we just kind of determined or were foundational for you. Those decisions are going to help you get towards these. And then kind of just putting everything together, we've got our values, our styles, and our goals. And this is really the kind of blend that kind of starts you off with the foundation of your leadership practice, what's important to you as a leader, what are your values, and then ultimately determines your leadership style, and then informs your behaviors so that you can get those goals and outcomes that you want as a leader. Again, as we saw when people put it in the chat, some people were very much focused on, or very much foundational in one leadership style. That's great. Transformational leadership or servant leadership were mostly informing their leadership behaviors, which is great. Other people had a blend of 2 or 3 different leadership styles. Again, it's all about what's right for you as a leader, and ultimately informing your decisions to help you get to those goals. So, I hope this activity and kind of got everybody kind of thinking about their leadership practice, and kind of understanding better kind of who they are as a leader. And, I would want to know, for me, when I was going through the activity and I kind of came out with my results, I kind of thought back to, were these results what I thought they were going to be? Did I think it was going to be mostly transformational with some democratic and servant? Was it a little different than I thought? I definitely encourage you to think about some of those things afterward. And as you start going back to your teams and acting on some of these leadership behaviors and styles, definitely think about, am I representing transformational leadership in the way that I thought I was? So just to wrap everything up, how does all of this help you be a better coach? The values are the foundation of your leadership practice. That's who you are fundamentally. That informs all of your leadership decisions and your behaviors. The leadership styles, they're informed by those leadership behaviors. As a transformational leadership, a transformation leader or a servant leader, those key components, those are going to inform your leadership practice. Those are going to be what kind of makes up the core of what you are as a leader, and your actions as well. And then it's about taking that and taking those tools and then going out and practicing that with your team. As a transformational leader, really focusing on being motivational and inspirational. As a servant leader, really focusing on putting the needs of your athletes first. Those are the intentional leadership decisions that are going to get you towards your leadership goals. But it's all about first figuring out who you are as a leader at your core, and then what leadership style and behaviors are best for you to practice. And I hope we've given everybody a lot of insight into that tonight through the workshop. So at this point, I will open it up to questions, comments, thoughts, and thank you so much, everybody, for participating.
I think it's great that you were able to take the concepts in your book, which again is titled Lead Like a Pro, and work them into something practical for the coaches to take away. So thank you for offering this. I think it was great. There was one question. What is Phil Jackson's style of coaching?
He's definitely a strong servant leader. He, in his book, Sacred Hoops, which is a very good leadership book as well, he talks a lot about servant leadership, serving others, putting the needs of others first. So he's definitely a very strong servant leader. And also so is John Wooden. In his books, he talks a lot about the power of servant leadership as well.
So I have a hard time. I come from a military background, and I still work with military. So obviously my leadership at work is very autocratic and authoritarian. What would you recommend for flipping that switch from dealing with 18 to 30-year-old grown adults with very opinionistic lifestyles to coaching 9 to 12-year-old youth and not treating them like they're in the military? I have a hard time differentiating that. At least that's what my wife tells me.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that's very common. I know for me, working in a college setting, I'm managing adults and professionals. And then if I'm going to coach my daughter's youth sports team, she's 4 years old, I need to differentiate those leadership styles. I think, one, what's really important is, really understanding and having a firm grasp of who you are as a leader when you're coaching kids. So, you have a deep-rooted understanding of who you are as a leader at work or professionally, but really understanding who you are as a leader for kids and the leader that you want to be, the behaviors that you want to act on for your kids, and really focusing on a few of those. So, if you really you want to be maybe more democratic or you want to be more transformational, I would definitely recommend picking out a few of those behaviors and really focusing on incorporating them into your coaching. Really start to differentiate who you are as a coach versus who you are professionally, and making an intentional effort to do it. I would start out with just a couple different behaviors. I know, like for me, when I make that distinction between coaching and administrator, I really try to focus on, positive, uplifting communication, motivational. I really try to focus on that a lot more than I do maybe giving directions or assigning tasks like I would in a professional setting. So really kind of working to differentiate and draw that line, focus on a couple behaviors that you want to just display as a coach that don't necessarily display as much at work, can definitely help you kind of draw that kind of line and help you kind of change your leadership style as well.
Okay, here's a question from Ian. Do head coach and assistant coach have to have the same styles of coaching to be successful?
So I really like that question as well. Me personally, I don't believe that it's necessarily even beneficial for a head coach and assistant coach to have the same style. It's not, I don't think it's necessarily a detriment, but I always encourage head coaches, to try to have assistants that have at least a slightly different, if not somewhat different leadership style than them, because I think it allows you to better meet the variety of different needs, personalities, traits that your team is going to represent. Me as a transformational leader who also is somewhat democratic, I'm only going to be able to meet the needs so well for some of my kids. There are just a few of my kids that aren't really going to respond as well to my type of leadership style. But, when I worked with coaches who were maybe a little more autocratic, a little more direct, maybe, displayed a little more authority, some of those kids who didn't respond as well to me responded better to that coach. So I think having that kind of diversity of coaches is really important. I think the same thing with teams and organizations as well, because ultimately the needs of everybody is different. And it can be difficult if you've got one leadership style or basically only one leadership style that everybody on the coaching staff is kind of practicing.
I like that. That's a great thought. Here's another question specifically about high school age kids. How do you recommend dealing with cattiness or uncooperativeness in this age group?
Yeah, so, with that, I definitely think setting firm standards and expectations up front is really important. So, if you're working with an age group where that might be an issue or you think it could be an issue, setting some clear behavior expectations up front is really important. And then holding everybody to that same uniform standard is really important to maintaining your credibility as a leader. So, again, for me, displaying a positive attitude, being a good teammate was always really important. So I worked really hard at the beginning to, one, demonstrate that myself as the leader, that this is the behavior that I think is extremely important, that I'm modeling for you to emulate. This is how I expect all members of the team to act, but also just stating at the beginning and then reinforcing, this is my expectation for everybody on the team, and it's a set standard. It's not some people can display different amounts at different times. It's I have a set standard that I want everybody to work towards meeting as a teammate, having a great attitude, respecting everybody on the team. So, ultimately setting those clear standard expectations and then reinforcing them, I think gives you the best chance to kind of maintain that standard. Then also hold your teammates accountable or hold your athletes accountable if they're not meeting that standard that you set, and have it be in a very fair and equitable way because you set that same standard for everyone. Go ahead, Jason.
So I've had issues in the past with parents not necessarily agreeing with the style of leadership that the coaches are exhibiting and displaying their disapproval of said leadership principles in front of the kids. What would the suggestion be for dealing with, I guess, unruly parents? The kids usually are really quick to adapt to different coaching styles and leadership styles, but the parents are typically more hard-headed. So, like, how do you broach that sensitive subject?
So that is definitely one of the top questions that I get whenever I speak or work with groups. And it's tough. It's really tough. I think going back to you know, kind of the question about dealing with you know, players who might not necessarily have a great attitude. I think setting clear standards and expectations up front is really important. Letting your parents know up front, this is the type of leader that I am. This is what's important to me as a leader. These are my expectations. These are my goals, you know, for the team. You know, telling your parents that up front is not going to ensure 100% buy-in, but it is going to establish, one, who you are as a leader, and it's going to establish your credibility that you have a plan and that you have direction. And a lot of respect can be garnered with that amongst parents, and it can help alleviate a lot of some of that second guessing because they know more of what to expect. When they just kind of see it for themselves and are drawing their own conclusions, there's definitely more opportunity for questioning and second guessing. The other thing that I would do at the beginning and then reinforce is creating an expectation from you and a way for them to communicate with you. So, you know, again, saying to your parents up front, if you have any questions about my coaching, if you have any concerns or comments, this is how I expect you to communicate them to me. And this is how, if I have any concerns or questions about your child, I will communicate with you. Kind of opens up the dialogue, builds that bridge as to how you expect them to communicate with you and how you will communicate with them. I think that's really important for coaches setting at the beginning, because otherwise, I saw this at the college level, without setting that expectation. I mean, you know, parents would yell at me from the stands during the game about what was going on, or show up at practice, or come to my office, until I established at the beginning, this is how to contact me. This is an appropriate time to do it. This is how I will be communicating with you, any concerns I have. And I definitely think that's even more important for youth sport coaches, high school coaches, because you're dealing with potential with parents much more than I was at the college level. So I definitely think creating that very specific bridge for communication up front is very important, and then reinforcing it. Because again, so much of kind of interacting with parents is about your credibility as the coach. And the more that they can understand about who you are as a coach, what you're doing, what your philosophy is, what your belief system, your goals, the less opportunity there is for them to draw their own conclusions.
I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight, and I'd especially like to thank Matthew for sharing all of this with us. So good night, everybody.